Okay, let's get started. Welcome to Constructing a New Social Compact. As I said, I'm Lane Windham, the Associate Director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown. And we are thrilled that you have chosen to be with us this evening for this important conversation. First things first, I want to make sure everybody can participate in our conversation. Tonight's discussion is going to be interpreted in Spanish. So this is our slide telling people how to use the globe at the bottom of your screen to access Spanish language interpretation. And we are also going to put this information in the chat. In addition, we are recording tonight's event. We are also Facebook live streaming it. Closed captioning is also available. You have at the bottom of your screen, on mine it says live transcript CC, and you hit that in order to access it. Okay, so tonight's roundtable discussion caps the first day of a 4-day virtual convening, featuring more than 25 sessions with 150 presenters from 5 continents. And let's get the full schedule in the chat for this. I see a question, will sessions be available via recording? They will. We have more than 25 sessions with 150 presenters from 5 continents, and we hope that you can join us for that. I want to acknowledge that we have a terrific organizing committee for this event. A group of more than 40 people have been very active in putting together this week's events. A special thank you to Knut Henken and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for sponsoring our convening. I also want to say a big thank you to our director, Joe McCartan with the Kalmanovitz Initiative, and especially Lily Ryan, who's been doing a lot of the work putting everything together. And it is Lily's birthday, so she's doing all of this on her birthday. We began this project at the height of the pandemic, when it was becoming clear that what we were all living through was going to be, deeply transformational. I think we all felt that. History reveals that major crises upend the status quo, right? Whether that's economic depressions, wars, and yes, pandemics create windows when major changes that once seemed unthinkable suddenly become more possible. And the coronavirus pandemic has certainly done that. But it's also thrown into sharp relief the systemic racial, gender, and class inequities that are embedded in the social compact. People mean different things when they say social compact. By that, I mean the entire regime of systems, structures, policies, institutions that govern people's basic security and needs, and how all of those things balance and work together within our democracy. As we'll hear tonight, the US manufactured much of our current social compact during the New Deal and World War II. And we centered a lot of our social safety net, which is part of that, around employment. And we'll learn tonight, we'll talk about how, in this country, we never actually required employers to provide these social goods. We leaned on collective bargaining and workers' organizations to do a lot of that work, and they set higher wages and benefit standards for much of the industrial economy. That system left out many women and people of color because the occupations they dominated, like domestic and agricultural work, weren't covered by much of the New Deal. And then, of course, the whole system started to break down in the 1970s when corporations worked to shed their role as providers of the social safety net and ramped up their resistance to collective bargaining and unions, and labor law was too weak to stop them. Then in 2020, the coronavirus showed us just how weak the whole system has become, drew millions of people out of work, of course, out of healthcare. I think years from now, the images that people are going to have about this time, I think about the long lines of cars with people getting food. Those are our bread lines. Tonight, President Biden's going to address a joint session of Congress, right? And we can sort of reflect on his first 100 days. In this session, I hope we're actually going to have a discussion that goes beyond that. and that's going to touch on the changes we need in the coming decades, changes that may set the stage for not just the next 100 days, but really possibly the next 100 years, right? As we rebuild and transform the social compact, how can we get it right this time? How do we center working people and their communities at the heart of a new social compact? And that, of course, is the discussion we're going to have with this awesome panel who we have brought here tonight. And I'm going to introduce them and then we'll get started. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order here. William P. Jones, Will Jones, is professor and director of graduate studies in the history department at the University of Minnesota and president of LAWCHA, the Labor and Working Class History Association. He is author most recently of The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights, which hopefully we can get a link to that book in our chat. He has written for the New York Times, the Post, the Nation, Dissent, etc. And he is currently writing a book that sounds fascinating titled Essential Workers, Public Employees, and the Dignity of Labor. Reyna Lopez Osuna is the executive director of PCUN, which was started by farm workers and is now Oregon's longest standing Latinx-led organization. Reyna is a proud daughter of immigrants from Mexico who came to Oregon in the late 80s. For over a decade, she's been a fierce leader and advocate for the Latinx community in Oregon, receiving the Immigrant Award from the American Association of Immigration Lawyers of Oregon, the Willamette University's Young Alumni of the Year Award. Reyna has helped lead the Yes on 88 campaign, Oregon's first bilingual bicultural ballot measure campaign. Reyna is also a member of the executive cohort of Will Empower, Women Innovating Labor Leadership, which is a group I'm part of. We're going to put a link to the chat to Will Empower so you can learn more about it, including our apprenticeship program, which is accepting applications through May 1st for apprentices and co-sites. Erica Smiley is the executive director of Jobs with Justice, where she has been instrumental in building power for working people, including being part of and founding the Advancing Black Strategists Initiative and co-convening a national strategy for essential workers. She's authored numerous influential articles, and she has co-authored a forthcoming book on bargaining and working people's democracy with Sarita Gupta, who was actually part of our gathering earlier today. She's originally from Greensboro, North Carolina, and has a passion for advancing innovations in the South. Smiley was also a recent fellow with Will Empower. William Spriggs is a professor in and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University and serves as the chief economist to the AFL-CIO. He chairs the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. From 2009 to 2012, Spriggs served as Assistant Secretary for the Office of Policy at the Department of Labor, having been appointed by President Obama. He's had so many roles, and I'm not going to be able to list them all here, but just to name a few. He was Vice Chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Political Education and Leadership Institute. He's worked with the Economic Policy Institute, the National Urban League, and is a former president of the National Economics Association, the Organization of America's Professional Black Economists. Wow, what a panel. Now I would like to turn to our discussion, and our format for tonight is that I'm going to pose some questions to our group for a roundtable discussion, and then we're going to save some time for audience questions at the end. If you'd like to ask the panel a question, you just put it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Use the Q&A function. So, Will, I'm going to start with you as the historian on the panel. Our social compact, is particular to the U.S., of course, and it's a product of historical developments. Help us unpack how our social compact developed and what those developments have meant for working people.
Thanks, Lane. I'm really happy to be here and honored to be part of this panel. I wanted to just start by emphasizing something that Lane mentioned, which is the backlash against the social compact that emerged during the New Deal, and emphasized that this was a social compact that was, we're gonna criticize it a lot tonight, but I think we have to keep in mind that it was actually fairly effective, and it significantly narrowed income gaps more than at any point in the history of the country, and significantly improved economic and social conditions across the board. So even for people who, as we're going to talk about, were sort of marginalized and pushed to the edges of this social compact, I want to keep in mind that it's certainly much more effective than anything in reaching, I think, goals that we all share than anything that we have today. I want to talk about three limitations of the social compact that emerged in the 1930s. And these are, the first is that it relied on employment as the principal vehicle for accessing social citizenship. So this meant that people got not just better wages, hours, collective bargaining rights through government programs, but they actually got access to things that are not necessarily tied to work, things like health insurance, pensions, through their employment. One consequence of this is that this excluded, obviously, the unemployed, people who were not employed. It also excluded the informally employed, so independent contractors. And this sort of sets up some of the questions that we're seeing really at the forefront today around gig work. People who, if you're not considered an employee, then there's a whole range of social rights that you're excluded from. The self-employed. It also excluded people who worked for not for wages, right? So housewives, caregivers. All of these people were considered to be outside of this social compact because of this focus on employment. So that's the first, and that's important. The second is that even people who were employed, important sectors of the workforce were actually explicitly excluded from many of the protections in this social contract. So most of the New Deal labor laws of the 1930s excluded domestic workers, agricultural workers, and public employees. And it's not accidental that these groups were the primary employment sectors for women, for African Americans, for immigrants, for indigenous people, and other people of color. And as a result, this social contract or compact reinforced and reinscribed really long-standing inequalities that went back to the history of slavery and settler colonialism and immigration exclusion that had really, for long shaped ideas about citizenship in the United States. I think there's a particularly important to note an irony to this, that these exclusions were often premised on the idea that this was actually essential work. And so some of the arguments for excluding, for example, domestic workers or agricultural workers or public employees was that these people were providing services that were critical to people's livelihood. And therefore, by excluding them from protections, they could provide cheaper access to these essential goods, right? So there's a sort of an inherent contradiction in this argument. And I think, again, we see echoes of this in the debate around essential work during the pandemic. The idea that, that the most essential people who are doing the most essential work actually have to do that cheaply, or we're going to deprive other people of these goods or services. So the second really important exclusion is that certain forms of work and certain sectors of the workforce are excluded. Finally, the New Deal social compact was also limited by a decentralization, a decentralized approach that relied on state and local governments and often private actors to deliver social rights. And this, probably most importantly, just opened the door for discrimination. So I think many of us are familiar with the exclusion, for example, of African Americans from public goods, from public housing, from public education, from health, and employment. In the South, this was true of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, also in the Southwest. This allowed, for example, when employers in the agricultural industry were given subsidies to help them weather the Great Depression, they were able to just kick their employees off the farms and keep those subsidies for themselves. So there was a high level of sort of autonomy, sort of local autonomy. I think we need to talk about the way in which this placed unions in the position of denying jobs and benefits to workers based upon their race and their gender. So the way in which the federal government sort of devolved power to states, local governments, and private actors, but did not include protections and prohibitions against discrimination. And this would sort of set up many of the important battles of the civil rights movement, demanding that the federal government, if it's going to devolve power, that it also require non-discrimination.
Wow, you just described like entire structures, like in tweet form. I mean, that was impressive. You packed a lot in there. Great. Bill, I'm going to go next with you. Labor and collective bargaining have long been at the core in many ways of our social compact, but working people and their organizations have struggled in recent decades. So from a labor standpoint, from a working people standpoint, what do you want people who are part of this convening, what do you want them to know and to be thinking about this week? In your opinions, how do we center working people and their communities in a new social compact?
Well, I want to do another comparison rather than the Great Depression, and that's to the 1920s, because 100 years ago, we overcame a previous pandemic, the Spanish flu that was concomitant with World War I. And so I don't know that you can automatically assume rosy outcomes to massive disruptions. And when you think about 1920, the similarities are frightening. Technological advance on an unprecedented scale, far greater than what we've seen today, that created what we consider the modern world. Many of the things that we celebrate with computers are really improvements on the underlying advances that took place at that time. So when you think of the disruption of movies, radio, the idea of instant communication, airplane flight, all of these things were revolutionary. And the area of medicine, to be able to actually do x-rays. And then, of course, we saw through World War I the destructive power of that technology. It created very rich people, and it impoverished a whole lot of people. So when you look back at the 1920s, it's very similar to today. Lots of promise from the promise of technology and technological advancement, but gloom, because the divisions of inequality and the heightened sense, not just in the United States, but globally, of xenophobia, of racism, of anti-Semitism. As much as we talk about the horrors of what we see with the police today, there's a special episode on PBS to recount Tulsa. And those who know that period right after World War I know that many of our cities were ablaze as white working class people burned down and murdered lots of Black people. And in Europe, anti-Semitism and pogroms to attack Jews were quite common. And in the United States, our response to a massive wave of immigration that had taken place at the end of the 19th century started the 20th century with a backlash against immigration. So all of the horrors were there, and we know we didn't correct any of them. We continue to have technological advancement, but inequality continued unabated and then we crashed the whole economy. So I think there are a couple of lessons to learn from that, and the lessons were embedded in some of the things we tried to do during the Great Depression. And one of those was to put the voice of workers into everything. By empowering workers, we not only got them to the bargaining table, but we actually empowered their voice politically. And we created a new politics that could defend the advances that have been made to actually do what Abraham Lincoln promised. We forget that the Gettysburg Address was to the victors, not to the defeated. We were to have a government of the people, by the people, and the key word, for the people. And how do you have a government for the people when the workers are not actively engaged in the political process to make it a small d democracy? It's astounding that a state like Florida, which you think of as very conservative, over 60% of the people directly voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. But look at what we're running into with the US Senate. The majority of American people want a $15 minimum wage. Economists have told us this is a good idea. We should do it. And you can't get it through the Senate. And so the imbalance that has been created and the loss of consensus is directly tied to the decline of the labor movement. The inability to hold politicians accountable for what happens for working people, the inability to have a government for the people, and here I'm using people to mean natural born human beings. We've changed things. People now mean corporations as well. And sometimes it feels like those people have more power than those of us who have heartbeats. So it's discouraging that we've allowed that to unravel. The labor movement was helped during World War II by the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which was the government's affirmative action plan at the time to ensure not only labor peace, but to make sure that our war industries wouldn't be segregated. As a result, union density for Black workers in the 1940s exceeded union density for whites, even within state. And so the labor movement emerged at its peak when it had its highest union density, with Black union density being at its highest. And the fruit of that was in the 1960s that Black leadership within the labor movement made white union members quite unique, because these were about the only white people in America who were in a major organization where they paid dues, where they had to work together, and where their leadership was Black. And the attitudes of the modern labor movement, as a result of long having, this is over 60 years ago now, having had Black leadership in various roles, is that the union movement is less, white union members are less hostile towards Black political objectives. And so this is important for our multiracial democracy, small d democracy, because it's important we have a movement, we have a space, a political space in which Blacks, whites, Hispanics, women, men, Asian, everyone has a common set of goals and can work together towards those common set of goals and practice the democratic process. So it cements a belief in the system at the same time as it gives a voice. Because people think of the labor movement only as being a white guy who's a construction worker. They just forget the diversity of the labor movement. The union density for Black women is higher than the union density for white men. So when you're looking at somebody and you say, is that a union member or not? If you're looking at a Black woman, she's more likely a union member than a white guy. So people don't appreciate the breadth of what the labor movement brings when it comes to that workforce, and the ability to bring people together for democratic purposes is a vital element in the survival of a democracy, and ensuring that we don't only care about the people who are corporations, but we keep our eyes on the people who have heartbeats.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding us, about the last pandemic, and that there's no rule that says it has to move in a positive direction. That's not how history works. So thank you for walking us through that history. Smiley. So, workers obviously have been dealing with changes in recent years because capitalism has been changing, right? And then the pandemic, alongside those changes, has created this sort of unique moment to envision, advance, and a new social compact. As you think about this week, what shared understanding do you think that we need in order to get it right this time? Help us think through the challenges and the possibilities for this moment.
Hey, thanks, Lane. I'm so glad to be here and to be able to be on a panel with Professors Will and Bill is a lot. It's really incredible to hear the two of them talk and to really understand the history. And I actually appreciate a couple of things that each of them said in terms of what's important for us to remember in this moment, because I feel like we often go back to the New Deal, but I'm not sure that actually takes us back far enough. And Dr. Spriggs mentioned the Gettysburg Address. I feel like the political situation in the United States is increasingly characterized by right-wing populism and how motivated or disgusted you are by it. A resurgence of right-wing populism has grown in numbers and boldness, both in the United States and globally throughout the last decade, emboldened by authoritarian leaders like former President Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, and of course, Boris Johnson of Great Britain. The reckless rhetoric of these administrations and their antagonistic relationships with facts has emboldened the most racist, xenophobic, sexist, and homophobic elements of society. And, perhaps nowhere was this more apparent, at least in the US, than during the insurrection on January 6th, when the Confederate flag made its first appearance in the US Capitol since the Civil War. This act was a reminder of what we're up against. Flawed as they were, the periods of the Great Reconstruction following the US Civil War were marked by consistent attempts to build a multiracial American democracy in all aspects of society. So when I think about what's fundamental for us to be thinking about in this moment, it's actually this fundamental question that they answered or were trying to answer then as well, which is, will we formally transition into a racially pure autocratic society, or will we finally step up to meet the challenges of our ancestors to build a powerful, inclusive democracy? It's another historian I know many of us are familiar with, Eric Foner, and he has a new book out called The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution. And I really appreciated this because it talks about those Reconstruction amendments, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery and all forms of forced labor, the 14th Amendment, which began to define citizenship in the country to those born in the country and kind of the rights that lay within that. Of course, the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote, starting with Black men. All of these represented efforts to actualize, perhaps for the first time, this multiracial democracy. And many of the gains made by our social movement since then, including the New Deal, were anchored in the promises of these constitutional amendments, at least for our movements. Women's suffrage, the New Deal, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. It's important for us today to see that the work ahead of us is 150 years in the making to complete the grand project of building a multiracial democracy in the United States. During the Obama administration, we attempted and failed to pass the Employee Free Choice Act to expand on the 13th Amendment. And shortly after that, we tried, also less than successfully, to pass comprehensive immigration reform to build on the promise of the 14th Amendment. And of course, we are in a live fight, which will hopefully be more successful than the latter two, to renew the promise of the 15th Amendment by advancing the Voting Rights Act. These are all small d democratic fights, you see, and democracy is more than elections. This is the other fundamental point that I think we have to carry with us as we think about the new social compact. While passing legislation is an important aspect of democracy, policy is also made at our work sites, our apartment buildings, community centers, and various other programs and agencies. Working people must have enforceable, not just advisory, but enforceable roles in governing, not just government, but in governing everywhere in order to have a healthy democracy. Our opposition could not be more clear about what democracy means for them. They've spent the past 150 years trying to eliminate it. These same gains that we've made have been targeted by conservative judges and elected officials who have intentionally, systematically rolled them back, many to pre-Civil War interpretations of the Constitution. So the Reconstruction project was incomplete. It was stopped in its tracks by those who wanted to reclaim control of wealth for a select few and put Black people and immigrants back in our place, if not on a plantation, then as precarious wage laborers in an informal economy. Even the protections we managed to put in place for wage laborers, of course, included exemptions for work done by women and people of color, such as farm workers, domestic workers, immigrants, currently formerly incarcerated people, as Will mentioned earlier on. And corporate CEOs have built on the practice of establishing subcategories of workers with limited rights, such as the modern gig worker or misclassified independent contractor, all direct descendants of laws preventing Black and brown workers from earning wages through exploitative employment relationships like sharecropping or receiving tips as opposed to a wage based on a subjective experience of our service as opposed to receiving a fair wage for our labor. I think it was probably best put by another historian, Barbara Fields, who appeared in Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War many years ago now, when she said, the Civil War is still going on, it's still to be fought, and regrettably, it can still be lost. And I think in this moment, this inflection point, as many of us has referred to it, if we don't recognize this fundamental tension, our opposition will continue to exploit these dynamics to erode our base, people who should be aligned with us against common enemies. The fact that Senator MacArthur and Marco Rubio are trying to push the Republican Party to be the multiracial party of the working class should frighten all of us, because that's exactly the wedge that we have to stop and prevent. Where people who, instead of identifying their actual exploiters and joining with immigrant communities, Muslims, and communities of color to make progressive change around their shared self-interest, these working class white communities can easily fall prey to the reactionary solutions touted by the extreme right that speak to their narrow, fear-based self-interest. This is not just a matter of what is morally right. The reckonings over the last couple of years are not just a call for our humanity, they are that, but it is also a strategic imperative for our movement's survival and the possibility of building a multiracial democracy. So again, democracy is not just a system of political practices. It must be applied to participation and decision-making in all aspects of our economic lives as well. Without one, the whole system of democracy is compromised. Many 20th century protections have been eroded, even perverted, to limit the democratic activities of the working majority. Even what we are able to codify through the New Deal only came after hundreds of thousands of workers were in motion demanding an equal seat at the table. So it's important for us to imagine what a 21st century framework for collective bargaining and a new social compact might look like. A framework that allows the majority of workers in this country to organize and collectively bargain, and gives them and builds up the infrastructure around them to allow them the space to actually do that and participate in society. So together, we have to draw this new picture of the 21st century union and like Professor Spriggs said, the 21st century union member, either adapting into them, putting energy into building with new groupings coming online each day, or building these organizations anew. Because of shifts in capital, like you mentioned, Lane, economic democracy in the 21st century cannot be achieved solely on a framework focused exclusively on work sites, supported by the legal framework of the National Labor Relations Act. Rather, we must explore a more expansive definition of collective bargaining that adapts to the context of global capitalism and all its features, including addressing the material and culture needs of the modern worker, who shockingly doesn't solely identify as a worker, but instead sees themselves as having a diverse array of identities. And I think this means ultimately changing the very nature of what a union contract covers, broadening what individuals can negotiate over and who they can negotiate with, from their direct boss or employer to the individuals with concentrated power in their sector or in their community, from corporate landlords, big banks, multinational companies, etc. And of course, confronting a system of white supremacy and movements for white nationalism must remain a central element of this overall strategy to prevent the opposition from dividing workers and weakening our collective power. So, when we think about a new social contract, we must imagine the infrastructure that, if in place, would free us all up to participate in democratic decision-making more and more actively at all levels of society. Unions have spent the last century fighting for access to social programs that should be provided by the government for everyone. And in doing so, this has taken union time away from negotiating over wages and the value of workers' labor and corporate accountability in workplace and movement issues. This has contributed to too much of our social infrastructure being connected to formal employment, from Social Security, healthcare, retirement, to say nothing of the near absent childcare and long-term care infrastructure, and thus to subject the history of employment discrimination linking back to the Reconstruction on any access to the social contract as it currently stands. If the pandemic has proven nothing else, it's exposed that this will no longer suffice. Too many people, disproportionately women, have had to leave the workplace due to a lack of care infrastructure. We have yet to understand the full extent this will have on their long-term sustainability, given the gaping holes in our current safety net. Like you mentioned earlier, Lane, in a few hours, President Biden will introduce one of the more far-reaching efforts to fix this, to start to rebuild our social safety net and restore our social contract. And, I just want to note like three really important pieces of this. The first one, of course, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, is the PRO Act, which, is going to go a long way in strengthening workers' rights to hold timely, free, and fair elections to form unions, as well as to hold more corporations accountable and protect workers' right to take action together by striking. Of course, it also includes this historic investment in long-term care and creating a path to a union for care workers, which is hugely significant because for a long time, infrastructure was just seen as roads and bridges. But in fact, as we've seen during the pandemic, if we don't have access to care, whether it's for child care, long-term care, senior care, then we're not going to be able to work. If we don't have roads, we can't get to work. If we don't have child care, we can't get to work. And of course, last but not least, requirements on corporations receiving American Jobs Care funds, and that we're actually hoping that in addition to some of the existing requirements, that they will also invest in having these companies follow strong labor standards, including prevailing wage requirements, Buy America provisions, project labor arrangements, and the like. I think the last thing here I want to say is, in a social contract, I don't want to let corporations off the hook. In some ways, this is a historic investment from the government in trying to rebuild our terribly, completely frayed social safety net. And I feel like many in the corporate sector, we need to actually demand that they match it, because there's plenty of money out there, and we actually need them to invest in our social safety net in a bigger way, either through collective bargaining or through direct taxation. So anyway, all of this is a huge step forward, and we still have a ways to go, of course. But I think today, just to get back to your original question, Lane, our job is to infuse the energy of workers who are already in motion, whether our institutions are involved or not, into structural changes that will lead to increased participation of those directly impacted in governing the standards and conditions of their workplace, their industry, and their economic lives. Nationally, this entails an agenda to expand voting rights at work, framing the PRO Act and other labor law reforms, from the Power Act to Essential Worker Bill of Rights to the Public Service Freedom of Association Act, just to name a couple, framing all of those in the same context as the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the thus far failed Equal Rights Amendment, all of which were designed to make the democracy-oriented amendments to the US Constitution work better in practice. So I think we have an opportunity to fulfill the promises of Reconstruction and carry through our push to expand our social safety net in a way that allows for democracy building in all forms of public life, intentionally choosing campaigns that align the shared self-interest of white workers, Black workers, and all workers of color against systems of white supremacy and corporate control. I really think it's time for our country to reclaim our country, for us to reclaim our country, and the vision so many of our ancestors intended for our future, to finally reimagine in this moment a democracy we're fighting for.
Great. So, wow, what an expansive view. Multiracial democracy where we are rethinking the bargain, the whole bargain, where we're holding corporations accountable. So terrific. I'm looking forward to discussing that further. Reyna, I'm thrilled that you're with us tonight. Farm workers have long been at the margins of our social compact. Not only have they been excluded from labor law, but so many farm workers are undocumented immigrants, and undocumented immigrants have also been left out of so many policies. How do we center farm workers and other workers in the Latinx community who have too often been left out of our social compact?
Thanks, Lane. I think that for me, it's always important that I center my community and my family and my own personal experience. I think about my father, who brought us to the United States, really following the migration of the work, first through the strawberry fields in California, and then eventually to the Christmas tree industry here in Oregon, where I live now, where we settled, where, we started our families. And I also think about what it's meant during the pandemic, especially just hearing you reflect on that and how hard my community has been hit, specifically here in Oregon, seeing that the rates of COVID have been between 30 and 50% throughout the pandemic, and seeing some of the highest death rates in the country. Our families make up a significant portion of the essential workforce, which has meant not only that our people are risking their lives every single day, but it's also meant that not all of us were lucky enough to survive it. People like El Señor Gonzalez, who is my high school varsity soccer teammate's father, who died during an early outbreak at a food processing plant during the pandemic, the same processing plant that my 65-year-old mother was working at. And, he wasn't so lucky. Our Latinx families are used to being excluded, unfortunately, from systems and safety net programs due to the mixed immigration status nature of our community. And what's that meant is that being undocumented and being a farm worker has gotten a lot more difficult during the pandemic. And it's also meant that even being a documented farm worker and essential worker in the essential food supply chain has only made issues that have been there before the pandemic just 10 times magnified. And I would say that one of the most impactful and sweeping exclusions that currently are in place that has kept farm work as cheap and exploitable labor and in constant fear of retaliation is really the lack of access to legalization and citizenship status. The last time we had it was in 1986, where my family was actually able to benefit from that. It changed the trajectory of our lives, from being undocumented to documented, which was the IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And it's just amazing how one little piece of paper can change everything, can change from living in fear to starting to think about how your life can be different. And what it means now to not have those things means stagnant wages, averaging between $18,000 to $24,000 a year here in Oregon. Not much different across the country. I would say even lower in some places. No paid sick leave, no access to healthcare, no retirement. Yes, housing, even some farm worker housing requires immigration status, and the categorical exclusion of unemployment insurance, FEMA relief, and other safety net programs that most of us just take for granted. And that right there is the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery. It's been institutionalized in the Fair Labor Standards Act and in the National Labor Relations Act, two of the most monumental laws passed in the New Deal era. The National Labor Relations Act excluded farm workers and domestic workers from the definition of employee. So that means that we don't have the right to unionize. We don't have the right to collectively bargain and have our union contracts be respected. And that raises a lot of eyebrows when people hear me, the president of the Tree Planters and Farm Worker Union, say that, because they don't understand that because of that law, it's very difficult for us to negotiate contracts. And even the ones that we have, it's been very difficult to maintain them because our jobs have been undervalued. They've been dismissed as unskilled labor, but we all know better, right? We know that farm workers are a very skilled workforce. It takes skill to harvest. It takes skill and stamina to do all those things. And then with the Fair Labor Standards Act, which excluded farm workers from overtime pay, from minimum wage, child labor laws, that's also been a very impactful policy. And today we're actually trying to pass overtime pay for farm workers in the Oregon legislature. And I'll tell you, it's been tough. It's been tough. So I can imagine how in a progressive blue state, and I'm quoting, air quoting there, it's been hard here. I can only imagine what it would look like on the national level to have that conversation. But in 1983, there was an actual policy that was passed, the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act, that required for contractors to actually get registered through the U.S. Department of Labor. And that has provided some protections for farm workers and even penalties to go after when there's harm that's caused when violations are happening. But even with the registry, it's a key source of accountability, not sufficient to ensuring farm workers are treated with dignity and respect. And what we need moving forward is really simple, but it has significant resistance from the largest growers in the country, moderates, yes, moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats and other business interests. And moving forward, what can be done first and foremost is large-scale immigration reform that gives all farm workers, and let's have domestic workers in there, all the essential workers, a pathway to legalization. But specifically for the purposes of this conversation, I'll stick to farm workers, and allow for people who want to stay here permanently access to a green card, and those who want to be here for the season, allow them to travel back and forth without being treated as second-class citizens and in fear of retaliation when they speak up about working conditions. Because that right now is literally anything, or else you're blacklisted forever and can't come back. In addition, we need strong policies that plan for the future of migration. Let's not forget that we have massive labor shortages right now, and we need to be able to create the conditions where domestic and international workers can come work in the fields, and it is a respected and valued labor. Not only that, but I think it's no secret that since 9/11 we've had these labor shortages, and legalization is gonna lift many bars for people that are currently living in mixed immigration status families, from access to healthcare, buying and renting homes, accessing unemployment insurance, which has been critical during the mass layoffs that happened through the pandemic, and FEMA supports. Let's not forget that, because just this past year, the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, had the experience of raging wildfires that burnt down whole cities, farm worker heavy cities. And FEMA wasn't able to support us because of mixed immigration status. These are critical, basic things that we need. So ending any and all exclusions of farm workers from both the National Labor Relations Act, from the Fair Labor Standards Act, must happen. These are shameful exclusions that stem back to Jim Crow era laws that were put in place during the that were put in place to oppress and depress the mobility of Black farm workers and sharecroppers. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now.
Terrific. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, telling us about your community, and also letting us see, that it's not just about the job, it's about all the different parts of people's lives being interwoven and the policies that impact them. thank you for helping us understand that. Okay, so Will kicked us off talking about some of the limits of especially the New Deal social compact, although he's pointed out that it also improved people's lives. And then we had Bill and Smiley who took it back and said we need to go back to Reconstruction. And Reyna reminded us again of some of the limits of that whole social compact. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the limits. Is the answer to come up with a new social compact, or is it to close the limits of the current one, you know, or some combination? I'd love to hear folks' thoughts on that. And I'm just going to open it for whoever would like to jump in on that.
Well, can there be a both and, Lane? I mean,
I love both and. Give me your both and.
I'm not trying to just cop out here, but I do think, I mean, I don't want to throw all the, you know, the baby out with the bathwater, just to use that tired metaphor, but, you know, there are pieces and elements of the social safety net that are great or could be improved, certainly. And I think, you know, if we were able to fix some of the gaps that embed discrimination in things like Social Security, I think that would be helpful. If we had, I think saying Medicare and Medicaid for all is not wrong. You know, I think when we think about how we want to expand access to healthcare beyond worksite negotiations, I think that's, you know, that's what we're saying. However, I think when we think about the container that it sits in, right now, our social contract, or what's left of it, you know, like Will said in the beginning, is anchored in this container of employment relationships, and was built in a time where a lot of the ideas and dominant cultural norms in society also embedded discrimination, as Reyna just mentioned. And so this idea that we can just fix that is like, you know, it's like trying to fix a rotary telephone when everyone's using cells. Like, why would we ever do that? We've moved on. And so I think we need to build a 21st century container that meets our current needs. They didn't have the level of multinational corporations in 1935 that we have now. They, you know, the idea, as Professor Spriggs was talking about in terms of technology, things have dramatically changed. Who your actual boss and who benefits the most from your labor are often different people. So who's signing your check isn't necessarily the person who can negotiate with you in terms of what power they have to actually do things. Sometimes you have to go up the chain to this ultimate benefactor, which I'm sure Reyna can tell many stories of in terms of farm workers. And so, you know, we need a social contract that protects these new relationships and that gives working people the ability to negotiate at all levels. You know, why are we limited to just this one narrow framework of negotiation through the National Labor Relations Act? It's not that it needs to be eliminated, but we need more of them. You know, that was just to maintain labor peace. That was just to keep commerce moving, as they said. Whereas what we actually need is something that benefits democracy overall. The social contract has to be anchored in the idea of allowing people to be able to work and participate in society politically and economically, not based on just what it might take, just doing just enough, the lowest common denominator, to maintain labor peace. So I do think it's a both and I think that the and is very much broadening the framework and container through which a social contract sits.
I think we forget what the original Wagner Act is because it's been so long since we lived under it. The ability of the labor movement to quickly come to scale was helped because the government wanted it, but also because the original provisions allowed the movement to act as a movement. So labor could engage in hot cargo provisions, could engage in secondary boycotts, so that, as an example, with Amazon and Bessemer, Alabama, if this had been 1939, then the Teamsters would have said to Amazon, oh, you think trucks are going to come into this place? You're arguing with these workers who work in distribution, but you need to deal with us because we're not delivering any of it. And then when their machines broke down, they would have said, but we have to have electricians come in. And the IBEW would say, oh, you think we're crossing the picket line to help you out? Not going to happen. That was a different movement. It was a different time. Part of what happened is that we stripped away the ability of workers to strike because now we can face permanent replacements. Part of it was the Taft-Hartley amendments that prevented this collective action and true solidarity. And the key part of that was the right to work laws were sold to white workers as you really don't want to be brothers and sisters with Black people. You don't want to be in an organization that forces you to pay dues in which you could have a Black leader. And then, of course, we had to deal with the Landrum-Griffin amendments that took place in the 50s that went after structures of the labor movement claiming that they were communist. And of course, we know in the 1950s, communist meant you actually believed that Black people had rights. This was to destroy the ability to organize Blacks and whites together in the South. And so we have to understand as people attack the Wagner Act, that's not what we currently see is a long iteration from that. And the wonder of the PRO Act is to restore all of those elements, to give back the original right of workers to act collectively as workers. And hopefully now we can get past this restriction of states deciding what labor law can be. That's what happened when we did the right to work. We allowed the Southern states to reassert themselves as the oligarchs that they were in 1860 when they decided they would leave the United States. So I think I'm bringing up the PRO Act in that because it, regardless of what shape we put this in, you're going to need to have a watchdog. You're going to need to empower people to be the watchdogs over this. And as Will said, you know, we pretend like there was a consensus in the 1930s over the New Deal. There was no such consensus. The Republican Party hated it, hated it, hated it, hated it. They thought it was overstretch of the government. They thought it was all communism. Those were their words of the day. And so we should never think that this was something that somehow or another, you know, everybody agreed. Everybody did not agree. The only thing is because the voice of workers was so powerful that we were able to keep the consensus for a long period where Republican or Democrat, you would not attack the minimum wage. That was not a partisan issue. It was not a partisan issue do workers get to organize. It was not a partisan issue over many of the things we now take as the good things from the New Deal. So I think whatever we come up with, it again, as Smiley was saying, you know, it's at its core, we have to reimagine protecting democracy. The same states that are doing the most retrograde steps to prevent voting are the same states that have the lowest union density. The same states that underfund K through 12 education are the same states with low union density. The same states with the weakest safety nets because of this carve out we gave as a compromise to these southern states are the same states with low union density. So I think we want to make sure that whatever we do, we center it on empowering workers to be a counterbalance so that there is a real counterbalance to corporate power.
And I just want to point out that for viewers who want to learn more about the PRO Act, Joe put into the chat a link that describes more about what this does in case you're unfamiliar with that. Reyna or Will, do you want to jump in on this question?
Go ahead, Reyna.
I don't remember what the question was.
Well, I think it was sort of, do we throw it out or do we try to rebuild it? And I guess, and I really appreciate Smiley bringing us back to Reconstruction. And actually, you know, it reminds me of Du Bois's great book, Black Reconstruction, which we should remember was published in 1935, right? So, and everybody was talking about the labor question, and Du Bois explicitly says, you know, we're missing the labor question. The labor question, to understand the labor question, we need to understand the history of slavery and imperialism. And this is, he says, this is the real labor question, right? So he's writing in 1935. And I think it's important to remember that, so what did he do? He said, well, let's study the last time we did this. And he emphasized, he talked about the weaknesses. He talked about the racism of white workers who led them to not join what he called the general strike to end slavery, right? He talked about the Ku Klux Klan and the way in which it attacked democracy and the sort of fledgling democracy. He talked about the failure to protect the rights of freed people and to give them land, right? So, I mean, he talked about the limits of what was then the old social compact, right? But he also, the main point of that book is to defend Reconstruction and to say, even in 1935, look at what it gave us, right? Look what it tried to do and what it actually accomplished. And I think in some ways, I think we need a similar approach, you know, to go back and say, well, you know, this is the value of history. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it does, I think, tell us, you know, give us an understanding of the parameters of the strengths and weaknesses of the system that we're in. So, you know, I guess I'd echo Smiley's answer, it's both and.
Okay. So I'll move on, and Reyna, we still want to hear from you. So President Biden this week announced a task force on worker organizing and empowerment, which in many ways centers worker organizing. You know, under so many administrations, worker issues have just been sidelined, and Biden seems to be really trying to center them. You could have a social compact that was universal, but that did not center democratic workers' institutions, right? You could create something like that. And so I guess my question to the group is it important to have democratic worker institutions at the core of a new social compact? And, you know, the PRO Act could fit into that discussion too. So how would we fit the PRO Act into that discussion?
Hey, before we answer that, Lane, can you just give us an example? Because I'm having a hard time even wrapping my brain around the assumption that you could do it without institutions. What would
you
that
could have so you could have, let's imagine you had universal health care, right? You know, which we all just got our shots from, right, from the state. But you could have like universal health care. You could have a more robust pension system that came through the state. You could have a guaranteed housing that came through the state that theoretically, I'm not saying you could build it without the institutions, but theoretically, you could do that without having democratic worker organizations at the core. So my question to you is it important to have democratic worker organizations at the core? And if so, why? And I do want to ask if Reyna wants to jump in, I'd like to give her an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's that, and we need to make it as accessible as possible, or else we risk continuing the mistakes of the past. Because even with a statement like, well, universal health care, we already can anticipate the battle that will be trying to get undocumented folks and mixed immigration status families. Even with the vaccinations, you know, in Oregon, it's only, there's 71% of the vaccinations are white folks, 6% have been Latinx folks. So it's just not going to be universal no matter what we do. So we do need representation at the table, not just from associations, but from people from different communities. And what it means specifically, if it was from a farm worker community, is that we would need folks who can speak to the undocumented nature of the workforce. We also need people to acknowledge that there's a lot of other barriers as well in terms of things just being in English, right? Because in the workforce that is representative for farm workers, there's up to, at least in Oregon, I'm sure it's hundreds of languages across the country, but there's up to 40 plus indigenous languages spoken of the workforce, which means that even someone like me who can speak Spanish isn't going to be able to actually communicate with folks. So we need to be able to have those voices be represented. We need disability justice to be taken into account. We need to be able to really center workers' stories and not just put out the data, but really listen to what people are experiencing, because it's so easy to hear the stat, you know, the average life expectancy of a farm worker, of migrant farm workers, 49 years of age. But what does that actually mean for people? As well as acknowledging that this work is really intersectional. So we need people to be able to come in with their experiences to talk about what it really means to be frontline communities as workers, not only through a new social compact, but as we talk about climate, for example, where a lot of our farm workers and many other frontline communities are seeing the effects of climate change before their very eyes. It's changing their work, it's changing the economy, it's changing the seasons where people are able to go out and make their money, right? And also making sure that we bring into account intersectionality when it comes to gender justice as well, because we also know that, yeah, we're talking about these very big positive changes that could happen, but let's acknowledge also that still for a lot of people, it's a daily occupational health hazard to go to work and get sexually harassed, right? There's some very basic things that we haven't even started from zero. We're starting from negative right now with some of our workforce, and centering farm workers really means taking into account these systematic barriers that are currently in place and really being able to cater to those complexities and making things that would traditionally be a barrier, a non-barrier. And for me, that's a huge part of it. And I really do appreciate what I've been seeing from the Biden administration. They're reaching out in ways that I've never seen some administrations reach out, mainly just because we went through something that was really awful, right? But I do wonder what the limitations are of that if we aren't able to bring in just regular working people to talk about their stories and what it means to have even someone like me who is a leader of a movement, but I'm not necessarily I'm not necessarily out there every day anymore, right? What does that mean?
So Bill, maybe could you jump in a little bit and talk about what your thoughts are on why it's important to have democratic institutions centered in this new social compact, and maybe fit the PRO Act into that discussion?
Yes, well, I think having the Biden administration make positive statements about it is really equivalent to what the Roosevelt administration did to enshrine the idea that labor unions would be players. It has to be a signal to the business community as to what the business normal would be. But as I mentioned before, when you look at states that are right to work, at states with low union density, the other elements of essential democratic things like K through 12 public education come under attack. They become part of a political football. they suddenly become partisan. Once you remove the threat that real people who are the democracy, the government of the people, the by the people and the for the people part, you are left with only corporations as being the organized. When the United States marched into Berlin and when the United States marched into Tokyo, the first thing they did was insist that the unions that the Nazis got away with had to be enshrined. We forced the German constitution to be changed to ensure that we wouldn't have a return to a government of the corporate elite. We thought that was our bulwark against the return of the Nazis. And we thought the same when it came to Imperial Japan. And it is, as Will said, you know, the history is complicated, right? Because the same riots that I talked about in the 1920s that were for the most part white workers burning up Black people's homes, much in protest to Black workers either taking jobs or keeping jobs that they had won during World War II. That same energy can be negative, but the labor movement has changed since then. It has become the movement that was different. It has become the movement of a multiracial organization of workers, and the ability to protect those rights at the ballot can only happen when you have a countervailing force that can really put the oomph behind the organizing. And you know, it was wonderful what happened in Georgia, but we also won the election because of Pennsylvania. And people forget my colleague at the AFL-CIO, who, you know, because people were talking about handing out Nobel Prizes for the election, and she is as deserving for what the labor movement was able to do in key states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada. And without her leadership, those states wouldn't have turned either. So I think having the government on the side of labor is important. Having a labor movement that is pushed by the government to make sure that it will be inclusive and will not discriminate is important. Those were the key elements that happened in the 1940s. And then you have the extra voice. Farm workers do have the right to organize in California because the labor movement stepped in. States are allowed to allow agricultural workers to organize, but that doesn't happen without a labor movement making it happen. In Connecticut, we have the same thing going on where the Connecticut State Fed is fighting for ag workers in Connecticut. You got to have that extra push to make these things happen. We only have about 24, 23 states that public sector workers have full collective bargaining rights. We're fighting for that at the national level as well. But that takes workers being bigger than simply thinking of them as they negotiate over overtime or they make sure that they get paid vacations. The importance of labor movements exceeds just that narrow view. And having the Biden administration make this clear to companies that this is an expectation is a powerful signal, because as Smiley was saying, it's also important globally. When the United States backs away, it's a signal to other countries as well and our trading partners. And so, you know, if you're concerned about racial harmony, there's a lot that has to go on in Brazil. There's a lot that has to go on in Colombia, and their labor movements are vital for that racial equity. But in America that doesn't care about these things is an America that also doesn't care about human rights. So what the Biden administration is doing is important on many different levels.
Thank you. So our time is flying, and I do want to make sure we get to at least a few questions from our audience. So if my panelists will permit it, I will ask a few of these questions. We have a question from Ben Blake for Will. Besides the rationale of excluding essential workers based on keeping their labor cheap and supposedly more available to all, were there other rationales for tying working class social benefits and rights to employment?
This is a good question. It kind of, I think, gets at Lane's last question about, do we need to do that, right? I think there are lots of reasons to decouple social rights from employment. I think certain rights need to be asserted as universal. And I think, to Bill's point, the labor movement often does that, right? We can see that, like, the fight for 15 is something that's sort of pushing for a universal standard. It's not tied to collective bargaining, but unions see an interest in, fighting for universal standards for all workers, pushing for things like universal health care, access to education. These are things that, it shouldn't depend on you having a job, and certainly not the type of job you have to have those things. At the same time, I think that particularly in the United States, and Alice Kessler Harris has written about this really eloquently, the way in which the United States really strongly attaches citizenship rights to employment, in part, because we're sort of obsessed with the economy and capitalism. And I think rhetorically, it's a very powerful tool to say, if you want to reward the people who actually make this country work, then you need to reward people who do the work, right? And so, and that's like, to get to Reyna's point, this is, we have people who are picking food for us and who are taking care of our children, and everything's going to stop if we don't have those people doing their, using their skills. And therefore they deserve something for that. And it's more than just a wage. They deserve social rights, that a decent standard of living and opportunity for them and their families. And so I think that there's a reason that, that was, I think, in part, the connection that was made by the New Deal to sort of assert that there are rights that are earned based upon people doing work, right? And contributing to the economy. And I think there's value to that. I think there's dangers to it, because it sort of opens up to the question, well, are people doing valuable work, And, but again, we could push that back on the millionaires, right? They don't work, they don't earn their keep, right? They certainly don't work for the amount of money enough to earn the amount of money that they have. So it's a valuable rhetoric, but I do think we need to be careful. And I think there's a lot of reason to decouple social rights from employment.
Thank you. This is a question from Knut Pankin. Thank you for this fantastic panel. This is a question for any of the panelists, and Reyna had briefly touched on it. How does the climate crisis fit into a new social compact? And he's also asking about this perhaps from a generational perspective. So let's bring climate into the mix here.
Gosh, I think it has to be together. It has to be made together. It has to be intersectional again. I think that one of the biggest things that is my dream is that after this pandemic, we're able to build resilience and rebuild our economy and build green jobs, clean jobs that are union and that are able to get us into the next generation, the next economy, the future, and get us to those goals that need to be met within the next, decade or so in order for us to be able to continue as as a humankind, right? Or all those scary numbers that get thrown out there with the data. But I also think that we have a real urban-rural divide that has only deepened throughout this, throughout the different campaigns, I think, that have been going on. And especially in Oregon, it was really clear when we tried to push some very, very big climate policies. we had some folks from labor at the table, but I think that it could have been more powerful if we had all of labor at the table. And our biggest opponents were actually rural communities saying, hey, what about our jobs? What about a just transition? And making sure also that the voices of frontline communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, are at the table so that we're really able to do something that doesn't leave people behind, and that we don't make the same mistakes as we have in the past as we're thinking about what a Green New Deal looks like and what resilience for our economies look like as we move forward with real climate policy that could change everything, could change the trajectory that we're on.
If I can build on that, I appreciate what Reyna says and agree with it in terms of building out green infrastructure and just transition and making sure those jobs are, workers have the opportunity to organize and collectively bargain. There are a couple of additions I would make. One thing, just taking from our experience in establishing the Always Essential campaign, is that we learned that through the pandemic, when workers were in some form of decision-making power before the crisis, whether it's through their union or some other form of labor management committee, they were better off. There was a study, I believe, out of George Washington about assisted living facilities in Connecticut showing that where there was a union, and there were 30% less deaths due to COVID than where there wasn't a union. And so we now, we've known it for a long time anecdotally, and we now know very clearly, like through scientific research, that when workers are in the position to be a part of decision making, when our impacted communities as workers are in the position to plan for the crisis before it comes, we're all better off for it as a society. The same is true when it comes to climate. We're supporting a campaign in Texas that has been supporting essential workers in construction and building services in trying to create and establish with the government worker-led structures to manage not only the reopening post-pandemic for their municipality, but also to essentially prepare for future crises or whatever this W-shaped recovery is going to be. And then, of course, many of us will remember they got hit with that crazy ice storm that shut down their infrastructure and their grid. And now they're building that into the decision making, that it's not just about a public health crisis, but also about potential climate crises and any other crises that our communities have to face, building up social infrastructure where workers are already at the table preparing for a crisis before it comes. So I think that when Reyna talks about resilience, and I really appreciate bringing even just that word into it, like we need to think about what it means to be resilient and what working people we need to be where in order to prepare for those future inevitable climate events, right? They don't have to be disasters, but they're definitely going to be more climate events. And so, thinking about what infrastructure needs to be built and making sure that if we're going to be creating more electric vehicles, for example, to reduce our emissions or whatever, that those are built union and operated and maintained and repaired union. If we're going to change our infrastructure, including raising roads and creating more opportunities for transit that don't rely on fossil fuels, that needs to include opportunities for workers to be able to organize and collectively bargain. And then likewise, the workers that come in and clean up. I know, an organization, Resilience Force, led by Saket Soni, is really looking at how these workers can be elevated to the level of, say, your average EMTs or firefighters or healthcare workers in terms of how they're seen in society and how their work is valued, so that when governments and governors call for federal dollars to clean up, that they aren't just going to terrible subcontractors who have bad practices and exploit migrant workers, many of the same migrant workers Reyna is talking about, but that they actually go to companies that employ good standards, where those workers are not only paid well for their labor, but also valued in the community for the work that they're doing. So the last thing I want to say, and this goes back to an earlier point that Dr. Spriggs made, is this question of democracy. Because even with your last question, Lane, I think I was still trying to wrap my brain around like what how does it even make sense not to have worker institutions and organizations, whatever they look like? Like, I'm not saying that, you know, every aspect of the current union has to be in place. I think, you know, our organizations, just as they always have, will grow, adapt, evolve, and adjust to the new conditions, and organized labor is no different. But I think that the fundamental thing in all of this, whether we're talking about climate, public health, just everyday democracy, is that workers have to be in a position to govern at every level. And I really emphasize govern. I'm not just talking about electing someone. Like when we knock doors in Georgia, which I'm sure we all will soon because of the regressive legislation that they passed, we don't tell people that they have the right to elect a senator. We tell them they have the right to vote. I think likewise, when we're talking about workplace organization, we need to be talking not just about the right to form a union, but the right to organize and collectively bargain, the practice of being able to set policy in a workplace and enforce that policy. That's ultimately what a union does. And so within the context of our communities, we need the same thing. We need more unions in our workplaces. We need more forums and institutions and platforms to negotiate our conditions in our communities. We need more platforms to be able to negotiate with the ultimate benefactors of our labor and of our work, the people who make money when there's a climate disaster. We need to be able to not only rein them in and create regulations and hold them accountable, but to actually negotiate the conditions in which they can operate in our communities. I think that's the fundamental piece, that whatever we imagine a new social contract to be, that absolutely has to be at the center of it in order for it to be a democratic social contract.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you. So we are almost at time. I have many questions that we did not get to, and I would love to continue this conversation, but we do have a presidential address that many people want to watch. I will just remind folks that we just had a taste of a conversation on climate. There's a whole discussion tomorrow that's going to be happening from 1 to 2:15 as part of our convening, which is an economy for people and planet. What would it take? Please come join that. And then another plenary session on Friday about the infrastructure of care. So please join those sessions, as well as many of our concurrent sessions. We have 25 panels and plenaries happening over the next 4 days. I also just want to end, I want to acknowledge that today is Workers' Memorial Day. Today is the day when we honor those workers who have been hurt or who have been killed on the job. This has been a very dangerous year for working people, for our frontline essential workers, many of whom are Black and brown, many are women, and many have been hurt or killed on the job. And so just take a moment to remember them. And I also just want to thank all of you for being with us today for this terrific conversation. And, you know, hopefully people will take this conversation forward over the next few days. So please come join us. Thank you very much. And that will conclude our session.